Jesus' ministry appears to have included a number of women, some of whom seem to have had a high profile in the movement. We know this for a couple of reasons. First, these women are named in the scriptures, and at that time, they were living in an extremely patriarchal society. And to be named in anything that was public writing was extremely rare if you were a woman. You would have had to have been very prominent and other people knowing that you were there, and so the writer more or less had to write you in. We also know this because the Roman commentators of the time would say very disparagingly that that early Jesus movement was a cult of women and slaves. Not, of course, meant in a very positive way, but noting how many women were in the movement. So Jesus is arrested. And what happens at that point is the male disciples leave the story. They sometimes get a bad rap for lacking courage. The truth is, I believe it was the right decision, certainly the pragmatic one. Had they stayed around to accompany Jesus to the cross and then to be there to witness his suffering and death, they quite likely would have been arrested as well, and their lives would have been forfeit, thus leaving the movement without quite a number of leaders that would follow after the resurrection. The women, however, were able to stay, and they were able to stay in part because their roles in the death of a person were to publicly mourn, to wail, as part of the way grief was expressed, and this was particularly done by women. And as well, it was usually traditional for women to clean and anoint and wrap the bodies for burial. So this was something that traditionally they would have been expected to show up for. Now, the women first enter this story again as Jesus is carrying the cross to Calvary. And we have this passage in Luke. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. We've been talking about lament in this Lenten season, and this is a classic example of lament. This crying out, giving voice to the pain and the injustice that they are witnessing. Also, tradition tells us that a woman named Veronica pushes her way through the crowd and past the guards, the Roman soldiers, and wipes Jesus' face. Now, all these people well knew that you were not allowed to touch condemned people. It was one of the reasons they were surrounded by guards. But she somehow managed to slip in and do this act of great mercy and also great bravery to connect literally, physically with him and his suffering. At the crucifixion, across the Gospels, there are reports that there were a number of women who stayed there. Mary Magdalene is noted in all four Gospels as having stayed at the cross. Mary, his mother, in two of the Gospels. Mary, the mother of James, also in two of the Gospels. And then a number of mostly other Marys, Salome, Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary, the mother of the Zebedee sons, were mentioned in at least one Gospel. By the way, this goes to the problem that I addressed last night about the anointing. Mary was an extremely common name, and in the scriptures, it's easy to get confused, and sometimes the writer themselves don't really differentiate, so we guess which Mary they're talking about. They stood there for hour after hour in what was specifically designed to be an enormously painful and slow death. And they simply stood and they bore witness to the suffering of this man who they loved and had been following. It is an enormous act of courage. I'm not at all certain I could have done it and not turned away. And so they stand there and they wait throughout these hours. And this, by the way, is our model in some Christian traditions on Good Friday from noon to 3 o'clock. There is a vigil. And that replicates the vigil of these women standing at the cross. And then toward evening, he dies. And what usually happened is that bodies were not removed from the cross. They were allowed to hang until the scavengers, the wild dogs, and the birds of prey would pick them apart, and then they would be dumped into a mass grave. But occasionally, particularly if there was someone powerful enough and wealthy enough, the body could be bought off the cross. And that's exactly how they referred to it. Josephus, one of the historians of the period, literally calls it that, buying someone off a cross. And Joseph of Arimathea appears to have done that because he was a wealthy man. And so it's the sun is setting, the Jewish Sabbath is here, and of course there's strict adherence to no work on the Sabbath. And so Jesus has to be put pretty hastily in the grave, and he isn't really anointed. He's wrapped up in the linen cloths that they'll have to unwrap again in order to anoint him with the oils and spices. And then Joseph of Arimathea rolls the stone over. And in Matthew 27, there's a line there after that that's really easy to walk by. I did for years until suddenly it dawned on me. It says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. And so they stay and they keep vigil through the night, which was typically done by the closest family members. And scholars who specifically study Mary Magdalene in particular point to this to talk about the very close tie that Mary Magdalene and Jesus had. The other Mary, most people assume to have been Mary, his mother. So I want to close with just a very short passage from Rachel Held Evans. It is easy to dismiss the women of Holy Week, to say their presence at critical moments in the Easter story is inconsequential, holding no significance in modern-day conversations about gender equity in the church. But I'm not convinced that it's unremarkable that God chose a woman to anoint the Messiah with oil and a mother to hear his cries from the cross. I'm not convinced that it's an accident that the first person to declare that Jesus had risen from the dead to a group of skeptical men was indeed a woman.